The first explosion came just after dawn on November 22nd, 1939, in the grey, restless waters of the Thames Estuary. The coastal freighter Magdalene was on a routine supply run to Shoeburyness, her holds filled with coal and canned rations. The sea was calm, visibility fair, there was no warning. A violent blast erupted beneath her hull, throwing black water and steel fragments skyward. Within seconds, she split in two and sank, leaving only a spreading patch of oil and the faint cries of her crew. What puzzled the Royal Navy wasn't the destruction. Ships had been going down since the war's first weeks, but how it happened. Lookouts on the nearby trawler Kittiwake swore there had been no periscope, no torpedo wake, no aircraft overhead. The ship had exploded out of nowhere. Within hours, two more vessels, the coaster Elizabeth Joyce and the drifter Stanwell, suffered the same fate in the same waters. Minesweepers were dispatched from Harwich, their crews dragging the familiar paravanes through the tide, expecting to snag tethered mines like those from the last war. But the cables came up empty. No horns, no chains, nothing visible at all. Lieutenant John Humphreys, aboard the minesweeper HMS Hebe, recorded in his log that night, "We are confronting something entirely new. Ships explode where no mine should be. The sound gear detects nothing. Our sweeps cut nothing. The men are unsettled. They whisper about ghost mines." The Admiralty dismissed such talk at first. Perhaps they suggested these were delayed torpedoes or sabotage by saboteurs. But when even destroyers began vanishing, hardened warships with hulls too thick for contact mines, panic rippled through the naval staff in Whitehall. By early December, it became clear that Germany had introduced a new kind of mine. Reports filtered in from merchant convoys off the east coast. Ships detonated without contact, often while moving at steady speed. The spacing of the sinkings suggested a weapon that lay unseen on the seabed, triggered not by collision but by proximity. On December 4th, the Admiralty's Director of Naval Ordnance, Rear Admiral Thompson, convened an emergency meeting at the Old War Room in London. The conclusions were grim. A captured German pilot, interrogated after being shot down near Southend, revealed that his Luftwaffe squadron had dropped special mines from aircraft into shallow waters. He did not know the mechanism, only that they were set to arm hours after impact, to prevent premature detonation. That phrase, hours after impact, drew attention. It explained why sweeps had failed. By the time the minesweepers arrived, the mines were already waiting quietly on the seabed, armed and invisible. The weapon, the Admiralty concluded, was a magnetic influence mine, a scientific terror beyond anything the First World War had seen. Captured fragments from one explosion were sent to HMS Vernon, the Royal Navy's mine and torpedo school at Portsmouth. There, a small team of engineers and physicists began piecing together the mystery. Inside the remnants of the casing, they found what appeared to be a magnetic coil and a primitive galvanometer, instruments that measured changes in magnetic fields. When a steel-hulled ship passed overhead, its magnetic signature would distort the Earth's natural magnetic lines of force. The coil sensed this disturbance, completed a circuit, and detonated the main charge, often 500 pounds of TNT, enough to break the back of any destroyer afloat. It was elegant and terrifyingly efficient. Unlike the spiked, horned mines of 1914, these required no direct contact, no chains, no floats. They rested silently on the seabed, immune to standard sweeping gear. Worse still, the Germans had incorporated a time delay arming mechanism, a small clockwork timer that ensured the mine didn't activate until long after it had been dropped. This prevented British countermeasures from intercepting them during early sweeps. For the Royal Navy, the implications were staggering. The enemy had turned the sea itself into a weapon, and the usual tools of seamanship were useless against it. By mid-December 1939, the shipping toll along Britain's east coast had climbed to dozens of vessels. tramps, freighters, even Royal Navy auxiliaries. Coastal towns like Harwich and Dover became ghost ports, their piers blocked by wrecks. Captain Edward O'Brien, head of the Mine Sweeping Division, later recalled in an interview, recorded in the Naval Historical Branch archives. "It wasn't the number of sinkings that frightened us, it was the method." The sea had become unpredictable. A ship could detonate a mine simply by existing near it. The Admiralty ordered emergency experiments. Wooden barges were towed through suspected fields and passed unharmed. But when a small tug with a steel hull crossed the same area, it exploded within seconds. That confirmed it. The mines were reacting to magnetism. The Royal Navy now faced a crisis not of gunnery or seamanship, but of physics. To fight the weapon, they would have to understand the science behind it, and do so before Britain's maritime lifeline was severed. The breakthrough came almost by chance. On November 23rd, a Luftwaffe Heinkel He 115 mine layer was shot down by anti-aircraft guns near the mouth of the Thames. Observers watched as two cylindrical objects fell into the mudflats near Shoeburyness, Essex. The area was cordoned off immediately. For nearly a week the mines lay there, half buried in the tide, their mechanisms still ticking somewhere inside. Engineers from HMS Vernon, led by Lieutenant Commander John Ouvry, were dispatched under orders of absolute secrecy. Working knee-deep in freezing water, Ouvry's team carefully exposed the casing, identifying the detonator circuits and the clock mechanism. "It was delicate work," Ouvry later recalled. "One wrong move, and the whole thing would have gone. But if we didn't recover it intact, we might never know what was killing our ships." After 2 days of painstaking effort, the mine was defused, the first live Type GA magnetic mine ever recovered. The casing, once opened, confirmed everything: magnetic coils, clock delay, and a 500-pound charge of amatol. That single act, pulling a live weapon from the Thames mud, saved thousands of lives. The mine was transported under guard to Portsmouth, where scientists and naval engineers immediately began analysing its circuits. Their findings would lead to the first counter-magnetic defences, including ship degaussing and magnetic sweepers. But on that bleak winter's day in 1939, no one yet knew how to counter it. By Christmas, Britain's merchant captains were sailing through waters that seemed cursed. The Admiralty's warnings were terse. Avoid estuaries at low tide. Maintain minimal speed. Pray you are not the next to vanish. In a confidential memo, the First Sea Lord wrote, "We face an enemy that cannot be seen or touched. The mine has become an invisible force, a product of science, not seamanship. We must now enlist our own scientists, or we will lose this island to the sea." As the year closed, a cold wind swept over the Thames, carrying the smoke of burning fuel from the latest wreck. The water lapped quietly over the site where the Magdalene had vanished. Beneath that calm surface, hundreds of German mines waited, silent, invisible, magnetic, turning the sea into a field of death. And in that silence, the scientific war had begun. By early December 1939, Britain's harbours had become killing grounds. Merchantmen lay half-sunk in the shallows of the Thames, their bows twisted upward, decks peeled open as if struck by some unseen fist from below. The newspapers called it mystery explosions. The Admiralty knew better. It was a new German weapon, and the panic was spreading faster than the mines themselves. In a grey office at the Admiralty in London, Commander Charles Ouvry of the Royal Navy's Mine Design Department was summoned to a meeting that would define his life. The room was dim, thick with cigarette smoke, and filled with faces that betrayed sleepless nights. On the table lay photographs of recent wrecks, trawlers, coasters, and one destroyer, all victims of the same invisible hand. "These are magnetic mines," said Rear Admiral John Godfrey, Director of Naval Intelligence, tapping his pipe against the photographs. "The Germans have found a way to trigger them without contact. Gentlemen, our sweeps are useless." Ouvry leaned forward. We'll need one intact. A live specimen. Until we have that, we're fighting ghosts. That chance came sooner than anyone expected. On November 23, 1939, an unexploded mine was discovered stranded in the mud flats off Shoeburyness, near the mouth of the Thames. It had dropped from a parachute, its finned casing half buried in the sand. The tide was rising. The Navy cordoned off the area, and Ouvry's team was ordered in. For hours they worked in freezing wind, the estuary air thick with salt and fear. Every step closer to the weapon was like walking into the dark heart of the unknown. The mine's surface was smooth steel, painted grey-green, with the Luftwaffe eagle still visible. From the parachute straps to the fuse access panel, everything screamed precision, cold German efficiency. Ouvry and his assistant, Lieutenant Jack Ryan, had no manual, no schematics, and no second chance. The only tools they had were spanners, pliers, and intuition. One wrong move, one careless jolt, and the device could vaporize them both. They worked in silence, kneeling in the mud as the tide crept closer. When Ouvry loosened the first bolt on the base plate, a faint click echoed. He froze, heartbeat hammering. Then, slowly, he continued. Inch by inch, the casing opened to reveal a glass sphere nested within a web of copper coils, a magnetic influence trigger. Inside, a small set of batteries and timing gears completed the puzzle. The mine was designed to sense changes in the Earth's magnetic field. The passing of a steel ship overhead would disturb that field, sending current through the circuit and detonating the charge. It was science weaponized, elegant, silent, and utterly lethal. By sunset, the mine lay diffused and inert. Ouvry wiped the sweat and salt from his brow as he looked out toward the grey horizon. "They've turned magnetism into a killer," he murmured. "And now we have to unmake it." The disassembled mine was rushed to the mine design department in Portsmouth, where it was studied under heavy guard. Within days, engineers began to reverse engineer its principles. They confirmed what Ouvry suspected. The Germans had combined two triggers, a magnetic coil and a clockwork delay, to ensure the mine wouldn't arm until long after it was dropped, frustrating attempts at tracing aircraft or patrol routes. Meanwhile, the losses continued. The Admiralty's reports listed ships sunk daily, trawlers off Harwich, colliers off Grimsby, and one ammunition ship near the Humber. Merchant captains began refusing orders to sail. The crisis reached the Prime Minister's office. Churchill, now First Lord of the Admiralty, read the morning brief with growing fury. "We are being strangled in our own waters," he barked. "If science is to destroy us, then science must save us." That became the unspoken creed of the small, secretive circle of naval scientists now racing to counter the magnetic mine. Led by physicist Francis Crick's early mentors from University College London and a team from the Admiralty Signals establishment, the effort spanned laboratories, workshops, and naval bases. It was Ouvry's diagrams of the Shoeburyness mine that provided the breakthrough. If the mine was triggered by a ship's magnetic field, then the answer lay in changing that field, neutralizing it. Thus began the desperate search for degaussing, a word borrowed from physics textbooks and turned into a matter of national survival. Engineers proposed encircling ships with electric cables to generate a magnetic field opposite to the ship's own, effectively cancelling its magnetic signature. Others experimented with portable demagnetizing gear that could wipe a vessel's hull. The first crude trials took place on an old trawler at Portsmouth. The men watched anxiously as the voltmeters flickered, the cables hummed, and the ship's compass spun wildly. It was dangerous work. More than one vessel suffered shock burns or electrical fires in the process. But by Christmas 1939, the Admiralty had its first working prototype of a degaussing system. Ships began lining up at dockyards from Scapa Flow to Falmouth to be fitted with the strange new gear. The crews called it the electric corset. Within weeks, the mine sinkings fell sharply. The Germans noticed, puzzled at how their silent killers seemed to have lost their sting. By early 1940, the British had not only solved the mystery, they had turned the tables. Ouvry's calm bravery at Shoeburyness became legend, his diffused mind displayed later at the Imperial War Museum as the weapon that changed the Battle of the Atlantic. Yet for the men who faced those first invisible killers, the fear lingered. Every creak of the hull, every ping from sonar still carried the echo of that first winter, when the sea itself seemed to come alive, and science became both saviour and foe. The war had found a new battlefield, not of guns and steel, but of magnets and minds. The idea began not in an admiral's office, but in the quiet hum of a physics laboratory. In late December 1939, within the Admiralty's experimental workshops at Portsmouth, an unlikely trio gathered around a chalkboard covered in magnetic field equations. Commander Charles Ouvry stood beside Dr. Francis Bate, a civilian physicist from University College London, and an electrical engineer named William Bill Stanley, who had been pulled from the General Post Office to assist with naval experiments. "What we need," Bate explained, tapping his chalk against a line of magnetic vectors, "is to make a ship disappear, magnetically speaking." Ouvry frowned. "You're talking about changing a ship's magnetic field. But the hull's made of steel. It's magnetized the moment she's launched." "Precisely," Bate replied. "Every steel vessel has its own magnetic signature, a sort of fingerprint. The Germans' minds are tuned to detect those changes, so if we can reduce or neutralize that signature, their minds won't see us." Stanley leaned back, cigarette dangling from his lips. "Neutralize a ship's magnetism? Might as well try to unsalt the sea." But within a week, the impossible began to look merely improbable. Using Ouvry's recovered German mine, the team constructed a small test tank filled with salt water and a scaled model of a destroyer wired with copper loops. When electric current was run through the coils, the compass needles nearby barely twitched. They were on to something. The experiment was repeated on a real vessel, the trawler Compass Rose, moored in Portsmouth harbour. The engineers wrapped heavy-gauge copper cable around the hull, bow to stern, powered by a dynamo on the pier. When they switched on the current, instruments on the deck registered a drop in the ship's magnetic field. "She's gone quiet," Stanley said softly. "Then we've done it," Ouvry murmured. "We've made a ship invisible." The term degaussing entered the naval lexicon almost overnight. Derived from Gauss, the unit of magnetic flux density, it described the process of cancelling a magnetic field, a scientific tongue-twister that quickly became a matter of life and death. By January 1940, orders from the Admiralty sent shockwaves through every shipyard in Britain. All naval and merchant vessels were to be fitted with degaussing coils. Dockyards at Scapa Flow, Rosyth and Liverpool became assembly lines for survival. Electricians worked around the clock, winding insulated cable around hulls, bolting junction boxes near the bridges, and rigging dynamos to feed power through the circuits. Sailors watched in fascination as their ships were wired up like Frankenstein's monsters. When the current ran through, a faint hum filled the decks, the pulse of invisible armour. "Feels like she's alive," one petty officer aboard HMS Cossack remarked, running his hand along the warm steel plates. The results were immediate and dramatic. Within weeks, reports of mine sinkings along the east coast dropped sharply. Where once ships vanished without warning, now they passed safely through the same waters. German minefields that had crippled British trade suddenly lost their teeth. The Germans, unaware of the breakthrough, continued to refine their designs. They began fitting mines with acoustic and pressure triggers, seeking to outwit the Allies' defences. But for the moment, Britain had seized back control of her lifelines. In the cold winter dawns of 1940, long lines of cargo ships steamed down the Thames and Clyde once more, each surrounded by an invisible halo of protection. The first magnetic war was tilting in Britain's favour. Meanwhile, Ouvry's fame grew quietly but steadily. The man who had defused the first mine now oversaw a growing scientific army, physicists, engineers, electricians, and naval officers, all united under the cloak of secrecy. The Admiralty called it the Mine Countermeasures Board, but to those within it felt more like a brotherhood of mines fighting a hidden war. There were setbacks, of course. Degaussing was not a perfect shield. Strong magnetic storms, poorly calibrated equipment, or simple wear and tear could cause a ship's field to fluctuate. More than once, a degaussed vessel met disaster after a miswired circuit failed to hold its balance. Still, progress marched on. By spring 1940, the first large-scale degaussing installations were operating at British and Canadian ports. Even Allied ships abroad, in Gibraltar, Alexandria, and Singapore, were fitted with the new technology. It didn't take long for word to reach Washington. American naval attachés in London observed the British system in action and cabled their findings home. The U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships began developing its own degaussing protocols, adapting them for the Atlantic convoys that would soon face the U-boats. The collaboration between science and seamanship became one of the war's quiet triumphs. Men who had never been near the sea, professors, lab assistants, electricians, now held the fate of entire convoys in their hands. And in those early months of 1940, as German bombers darkened the skies over the Channel and mines still lurked beneath the waves, there was a sense among Britain's engineers that something profound had changed. For the first time in modern war, victory was not being forged in the guns of battleships or the courage of pilots, but in the equations of physicists, the loops of copper wire, and the delicate balance of magnetic fields. As Ouvry wrote in his private notes that spring, "This is a war of steel and circuits, of science and salt water. If the enemy believes his mines will strangle us, he underestimates the ingenuity of desperate men. We have learned to make the sea forget us, and indeed the sea began to forget, or at least to forgive. The invisible war had found its first counterspell." But deep in Berlin's laboratories, a new generation of German engineers was already preparing an answer, one that would force the Allies to adapt yet again. By the spring of 1940, the Battle of the Magnetic Mines had evolved into a full-fledged duel of mines. What had begun as a desperate defence along Britain's coastlines had transformed into a clandestine scientific arms race fought in laboratories, dockyards, and the depths of the North Sea. While British naval crews celebrated the success of degaussing, German engineers at the Kiel Naval Testing Command, East-Ella Kiel, puzzled over the sudden decline in mine effectiveness. Field reports from the Luftwaffe's mine-laying squadrons, particularly the Kampfgeschwader 100, spoke of missions well executed, mines dropped precisely in convoy lanes, yet few resulting sinkings. "Either the British no longer sail there," remarked one Kriegsmarine officer in frustration, "or they have found a way to trick the Earth's own magnetism." In Berlin, the Naval Ordnance Office convened emergency conferences. The chief scientist, Dr. Heinz Schlicker, a brilliant physicist from Göttingen, proposed a chilling possibility. The British have discovered how to neutralize the magnetic signature of their ships. His conclusion was correct, though the Germans would not confirm it until captured documents in 1945. For now they could only speculate and react. On the British side, the counterintelligence operation was equally intense. The Admiralty knew that if Germany discovered the principle of degaussing, they would redesign their mines accordingly. Thus, the entire programme was classified most secret, restricted to fewer than 100 officers and engineers across the Empire. Ships fitted with coils were forbidden to mention them in logs. Even the term degaussing was banned from written reports, replaced with code phrases such as electrical trimming or hull balancing. To maintain secrecy, installations were often performed under the cover of routine refits or maintenance. At Portsmouth, Commander Ouvry worked tirelessly to improve the system. His team developed portable degaussing ranges, underwater sensor grids anchored near harbour entrances, which could measure a ship's residual magnetism as it passed. Crews learned to adjust their coils until the readings showed near zero deflection. To the untrained eye, it looked like ritual, a destroyer slowly steaming back and forth, officers watching gauges, electricians fine-tuning dials. But to those involved, it was as crucial as sighting in a rifle. A miscalibration of a few Gauss points could mean death. By mid-1940, Britain's merchant fleet, the arteries of her survival, began to regain confidence. Convoys reformed. Tankers from Trinidad, freighters from Halifax, trawlers from Hull, all now equipped with invisible shields of magnetism. Lieutenant Peter Cansdale of HMS Puffin, a mine-sweeping sloop, wrote in his diary, "For the first time since the autumn, we are sailing with some measure of faith. The sea still hides death, but we no longer feel utterly blind. Still, the work was exhausting. Degaussing demanded constant vigilance. Engineers had to retest coils every few weeks as hull magnetism shifted with wear, shock, and latitude. Ships that sailed into the far north found their protection weakened. The Earth's magnetic field varied with position, forcing constant recalibration. It became a strange new seamanship, one foot in the age of iron, another in the realm of invisible physics. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Germans countered. Schlicker and his team developed combined magnetic acoustic mines, which could detect both the metal signature and the sound of a ship's propellers. Others were fitted with pressure sensors, designed to detonate beneath a passing hull. In July 1940, the first such mines appeared off Dover and Harwich, sinking 2 trawlers despite their degaussing coils. The Admiralty realised the arms race had entered a new phase. To counter, the British established the Mine Design Department at HMS Vernon, where captured mines were dismantled, tested, and their secrets extracted. It became a dangerous but vital laboratory, a place where each innovation cost lives but bought knowledge. Here, Ouvry's successors developed magnetic sweeps with rotating electric fields, designed to mimic a ship's passage and prematurely detonate mines at a safe distance. It was an elegant inversion of the German design, a war of deception between magnets played out beneath the waves. By autumn, the invisible war had spread across the globe. Canadian shipyards fitted coils on corvettes. American engineers adopted the British principles for their convoy escorts. Even Australian shipwrights at Cockatoo Island followed the same blueprints. For the first time, the Allies fought not just with guns, but with equations. The struggle between magnet and countermagnet was rewriting the very nature of naval warfare. As Commander Ouvry wrote in a private letter to his wife that November, "It is strange, my dear, to fight an enemy we cannot see and defeat him with forces we do not feel. But perhaps that is the future of war, the silent struggle of invisible things shaping the fate of men." And so the war beneath the war continued, silent, unseen, yet no less deadly. Next chapter. The Battle of the Coils. How the magnetic duel spread to the Atlantic convoys and drew America's engineers into the fight. By 1941, the invisible war that had begun in the Thames Estuary had crossed the Atlantic. German mine-laying aircraft and U-boats extended their reach, sowing magnetic death along convoy routes stretching from Iceland to Nova Scotia. Merchant ships burned in silent explosions far from any visible enemy. For the first time, the United States, still officially neutral, faced the magnetic menace directly. At the U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships, reports from Britain painted a grim picture. Standard sweeping techniques were obsolete, and the new magnetic mines ignored even the most cautious navigation. American destroyers had already suffered losses off Iceland. If the Allies were to maintain the lifeline between Britain and the New World, the US would have to master the strange science of magnetic protection, and fast. In early 1941, Admiral Harold Bowen of the Naval Research Laboratory, NRL, visited Britain under secrecy. What he saw at Portsmouth's degaussing range stunned him. Freighters passing silently over submerged sensors, their magnetic readings reduced nearly to zero. The British system was elegant, simple copper coils powered by generators, but it worked. Bowen returned to Washington with blueprints and a promise of collaboration. Within weeks, a new department was created, the Magnetic Defense Division. Under the direction of Commander L.A. Hyland, teams of electricians and scientists began adapting the British designs to American shipyards. At Boston Navy Yard, the first experimental coil was fitted to a destroyer escort, USS Herbert. She steamed down the coast for tests, passing over measuring loops installed in the harbour. The results mirrored those from Britain. The magnetic signature dropped by over 90%. The system worked. Word spread quickly. By the summer of 1941, degaussing installations were being fitted on every new U.S. naval vessel. Even the great carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, and Lexington, received magnetic shielding before sailing into the Pacific. The process, however, was not easy. Shipyards strained under the weight of new wartime production, and the complex wiring demanded trained electricians. Mistakes could be fatal. A single reversed polarity could actually increase a ship's magnetic field, making it more likely to trigger a mine. Crews were hastily trained in deperming, the process of neutralizing permanent magnetism using heavy electrical discharges before applying degaussing coils. At the Norfolk Navy Yard, sailors joked that their destroyers were getting X-rayed before deployment. But the tone changed when a mine detonated under an unprotected tanker off Newfoundland, tearing it in half. After that, even the skeptics demanded coils before sailing. Meanwhile, across the sea, the Kriegsmarine responded with relentless ingenuity. The Luftwaffe's mine-laying units began using improved models, Type GC and GD mines, with dual triggers, magnetic and acoustic. Now, even ships whose fields were neutralized could be detected by the rhythm of their engines. The results were devastating. In November 1941, a convoy off Ireland lost 3 ships in one night to the new mines. "They've made the sea listen to us," a British officer wrote grimly. In response, Allied engineers developed degaussing plus acoustic decoys, devices called Foxer and FXR, towed behind ships to confuse acoustic sensors with a constant clatter. The battle had evolved into a symphony of deception, magnetic, electric, and sonic. By late 1942, the Allies had perfected what they called comprehensive magnetic protection. Every convoy ship, from tankers to tugs, was measured, depermed, and wired before sailing. Degaussing stations dotted both sides of the Atlantic, Halifax, New York, Liverpool, Belfast, and Gibraltar, all coordinated through the Allied Naval Magnetic Board. The system's scale was staggering. According to post-war US Navy records, more than 4,500 Allied ships were fitted with permanent degaussing coils by mid-1943. Another 2,000 received temporary portable coils installed in theatre. The payoff came swiftly. The rate of mine-induced sinkings plummeted by nearly 80%. Convoy HX-229, which had lost 6 ships to magnetic mines in 1941, sailed through the same route in 1943 without a single loss. German commanders began to complain that the British ships have become ghosts. Even Japanese naval attachés in Berlin took notice. One intelligence cable from March 1943 recorded an admiral's astonishment. "It is as if the Anglo-Americans have made their ships non-metallic. Our allies' minds are deaf and blind." The science of magnetism now spanned the globe. In Alexandria, Royal Navy engineers depermed battleships under desert heat. In Fremantle, Australian dock workers coiled copper cable around submarines bound for the Java Sea. Even Soviet ships received technical assistance through Lend-Lease, their Arctic convoys protected by British-designed magnetic loops beneath the ice. The war that had begun with explosions in the Thames Estuary was now fought with mathematics and copper wire from the Orkneys to the Coral Sea. But it remained a race. The Germans' magnet mine C, introduced in 1943, incorporated a ship counter, a device that ignored the first few ships to pass and detonated only after several had gone by, foiling sweeping tactics. Each innovation forced new Allied adaptations. In laboratories from Portsmouth to Philadelphia, scientists worked without rest. The war was no longer just about who had the largest guns, but who understood the unseen forces beneath the sea. As one US Navy scientist wrote in a 1944 report, "The enemy has taught us to fight not with armour, but with the unseen. This is the first true war of physics, and by mastering that physics, the Allies had turned the tide." Next chapter. Magnet versus Magnet, the final duel in the Channel, 1944, where Germany's last supermines met the full power of Allied science in the build-up to D-Day. The grey dawn of December 23, 1939, broke cold and windless over the Kent coast. The sea lay like dull metal beneath a leaden sky, and just beyond the mouth of the Thames, the Royal Navy minesweeper HMS Hebe rocked idly at anchor. The crew had spent weeks chasing ghosts, mines that sank ships but left no trace, explosions that seemed to bloom out of empty water. Then came the signal from Whitstable. Object resembling mine beached on foreshore. Commander John Ouvry was roused before first light. A veteran diver and explosives expert, he had been at the centre of Britain's frantic attempts to understand Germany's new weapon. The message from the Kent coast was their first break, the first chance to see one intact. Within the hour, Ouvry and his small party from HMS Vernon, the Royal Navy's mine and torpedo school at Portsmouth, were heading for the Thames Estuary. The journey east felt heavy with expectation. The roads were choked with military traffic and blackout shutters. London, only a few miles inland, had taken on the anxious stillness of a city preparing for siege. Ouvry sat silent in the back of the truck, turning the facts over in his mind. The magnetic mine was invisible, untouchable. It killed without contact, triggered by the Earth's magnetic field and the steel hull of a ship disturbing it. Conventional sweeping wires and paravanes were useless. There was nothing physical to cut, no trigger to snag. When they arrived at Whitstable, a ring of Royal Engineers and local Home Guard had already cordoned off the beach. The tide had gone out, leaving a stretch of hard, wet sand where the mine lay, a bulbous, barnacle-streaked cylinder half buried near the waterline. The air was raw and smelled of salt and seaweed, the waves hissing faintly in the cold. Ouvry surveyed the object in silence. It was a monster of a weapon. Nearly 8 feet long, its steel skin dented and blackened from the journey ashore. On its underside, faint German markings were still visible. Luftwaffe Eigentum. The mine had been dropped from an aircraft, not laid by a submarine. It had likely armed itself automatically after hitting the water, and by sheer luck or malfunction failed to detonate. Every man on the beach knew they stood within a few yards of death. The magnetic influence trigger could still be alive, any movement or tool strike potentially fatal. Ouvry's team, Lieutenant Roger Lewis, Petty Officer Baldwin, and a handful of sappers, began preparing their gear with quiet precision. They wore no heavy boots or metal buckles, only soft shoes and cloth overalls. Every piece of equipment was checked twice for stray iron. "Right," Ouvry said softly, his breath fogging in the morning air. "We take her like a surgeon takes a tumour, no sudden moves." He approached the mine slowly, crouching beside the corroded casing. His gloved fingers brushed sand away from the base plate, revealing a small access panel bolted into the shell. He loosened the fastenings, every twist of the spanner deliberate, controlled. When the panel came free, a faint ticking sounded from within. Not mechanical, but the subtle vibration of seawater trapped inside the chamber. The interior was a labyrinth of delicate mechanisms, coils, batteries, and an intricate magnetic sensor. Ouvry recognized the principle at once. The mine contained a magnetic influence unit tuned to detect the field disturbance of a passing steel ship. Once a threshold was reached, a relay would close the circuit and fire the detonator. Simple in theory, deadly in execution. But what caught his attention was the small timing device mounted above the trigger circuit. It was a clockwork arming delay, a safeguard ensuring the mine would not activate until hours after being dropped. That explained how the Germans had seeded the Thames and Humber without losing their own aircraft. The mines armed themselves only after the planes had cleared the area. As the tide began to creep back up the beach, Ouvry worked steadily. Each minute felt like an hour. Sweat prickled beneath his oilskin collar despite the cold. Behind him, Lewis whispered coordinates into his notebook, recording every detail. The others stood well back, watching in taut silence. At last, Ouvry located the primer housing. It was capped with a cylindrical plug, bearing faint traces of red paint. Inside would be the detonator, wired directly to the firing circuit. He exhaled, steadied his hand, and began to unscrew the plug. A grain of sand slipped beneath the wrench. The metal gave a small squeal. Every man froze. Then, nothing. When the detonator finally came free, Ouvry lifted it carefully and held it up. A dull brass cylinder, smaller than a finger, and yet the heart of the weapon that had sunk half a dozen British ships in silence. He handed it off to Baldwin, who wrapped it in oilcloth and placed it gently into a lead-lined box. By early afternoon, the mine was disarmed. The team dismantled it section by section, photographing everything. The parts would be taken to Portsmouth for study. As the tide reclaimed the sand, the men withdrew in orderly silence. Ouvry lingered a moment, looking back at the faint impression the mine had left in the beach. He felt no triumph, only exhaustion, and a quiet dread. The weapon was brilliant in its simplicity, scientific in its ruthlessness. It was not just a mine. It was a message from a new kind of warfare, one fought in laboratories and workshops as much as in the sea. When the team returned to HMS Vernon that night, the Admiralty was waiting. Engineers, physicists and officers crowded the debriefing room, their breath steaming in the chill air. Ouvry laid the disarmed detonator on the table and said simply, "Gentlemen, this is how they're doing it." The room fell silent. They all understood at once. The era of visible enemies, of periscopes and torpedo wakes, was over. The sea itself had turned against them. That night, in the cramped laboratories at Vernon, work began on a countermeasure: coils of copper wire, prototype degaussing loops, and the first rough experiments with neutralizing ship magnetism. Britain's answer to the magnetic mine had been born, not in the roar of battle, but on a bleak December beach beneath a colourless sky. And as Commander Ouvry wrote in his report before dawn, "It was not courage alone that saved us, but curiosity." The war beneath the waves had entered its next invisible phase. At the Portsmouth naval base, dawn came pale and reluctant, filtering through the frosted windows of HMS Vernon's laboratory workshops. The German magnetic mine recovered at Whitstable lay in pieces on a long wooden bench, its inner organs spread out like those of a dissected beast. Around it clustered a half-dozen of Britain's finest scientific minds, naval engineers, physicists and ordnance officers, all wrestling with the same question: how do we make our ships invisible to magnetism itself? The first days were feverish. Ouvry's disarmed mine confirmed what many had feared, that the Germans were not simply using brute explosives, but physics. Inside the steel casing had been a magnetically tuned sensor coil designed to detect even minute changes in the Earth's magnetic field caused by a ship's hull. Once triggered, it sent a pulse through a firing relay. Instantaneous, silent, unstoppable. Captain Edward Terrell, commanding Vernon's research division, tapped a pencil against his teeth as he stared at the diagrams. If a ship's field sets it off, he muttered. "Then we must find a way to erase the field." That was the seed of the idea that would become degaussing, a term that would soon spread through every dockyard in Britain. It was a bold reversal of the Germans' logic. If the enemy's weapon hunted magnetic signatures, the British would simply make their ships magnetically neutral. But turning theory into practice would demand improvisation, danger, and an alliance between the Navy and civilian science, unlike any seen before. Within days, the workshops of Vernon became a battlefield of ideas. Technicians wrapped copper cables around small steel plates, pulsing them with electric current to see if they could counter their natural magnetism. Sparks flew, breakers tripped, tempers flared. But bit by bit, progress came. By the end of December, a crude system emerged, one that involved coiling electric cables around the hull of a ship, energizing them with direct current to create an opposing magnetic field. They called it the degaussing coil. The first test took place aboard the coastal sweeper HMS Babbacombe. The ship's crew, half sceptical, half terrified, watched as teams ran thick copper wire around her hull and powered it from a generator on the dock. When the current was switched on, the needle on the magnetic detector quivered, then dropped. A ripple of relief went through the team. "If the theory holds," Tyrrell said, "she'll no longer be seen by the mine." But theories in wartime were cheap. Proof required risk. To test the system, Babbacombe was sent to a controlled area off Portsmouth where dummy mines had been moored. The sea was glass smooth as she eased forward, the men silent at their stations. Each minute stretched into an hour. The mine should have detonated as she passed overhead, yet nothing happened. Only the faint hum of the generators and the steady wash of the tide. "By God," whispered the chief engineer, "we've done it." That night, a cable flashed from Portsmouth to the Admiralty. Degaussing successful. Countermeasure effective. Orders went out within hours. Every ship in the Royal Navy, from destroyers to trawlers, would be fitted with degaussing coils. The operation would be immense, involving thousands of electricians and dockyard workers, but it promised salvation from an invisible enemy. Shipyards at Rosyth, Chatham and Devonport burned through the winter nights, their docks alive with welding torches and the clang of cable drums. Still, the battle was far from over. Reports from the North Sea told of new mines, ones that seemed immune to the early degaussing fields, as though the Germans were adapting their sensors. Some detonated from acoustic signatures, triggered by propeller noise, others by pressure changes in the water. Britain had entered an arms race not of guns and armour, but of equations and electromagnetic flux. By early 1940, a new kind of warfare had taken hold, the scientific war. Naval officers found themselves working side by side with men from Cambridge and Birmingham, their blackboards filled with waveforms and field equations. Laboratories became front lines. One evening, Commander Ouvry stood by the water's edge at Portsmouth, watching as a degaussed minesweeper eased out into the Solent. The sky above was violet with the last light of day, the ship's wake glowing faintly in the dusk. For the first time in months, he felt something like hope. "They won't stop, you know," said Tyrrell, stepping up beside him. "They'll keep finding new ways to strike unseen." "I know," Ouvry replied, "but now so will we." A silence settled between them, not of despair, but of determination. The sea had turned deadly, but it had also become a proving ground for minds as sharp as steel. The enemy's invisible weapon had forced Britain to evolve, to turn fear into invention. As the ship disappeared into the night, her magnetic coils humming quietly beneath the hull, Ouvry allowed himself a rare smile. The war beneath the waves would continue, unseen but relentless, a contest not of force but of thought. And somewhere in the depths of the North Sea another mine waited, ticking softly in the dark, while men on both sides prepared their next move in the invisible war. By the first months of 1940, a quiet revolution was underway across Britain's naval bases. What began in the cramped laboratories of HMS Vernon had spread to the shipyards of Rosyth, Devonport, and Liverpool, miles of copper cable being wound around hulls, new blueprints drawn up by physicists and electricians working through the blackout. The Royal Navy had become an experiment in motion. Every destroyer, merchantman, and minesweeper a floating laboratory. But the enemy had not been idle. In January, the Admiralty received reports of ships exploding despite degaussing. When divers examined the wrecks, they found fragments of mines with new components, not magnetic sensors, but tiny diaphragms and valves. The Germans had moved on to acoustic mines, triggered by the hum of engines and the beat of propellers. In a grey office overlooking the Solent, Captain Edward Terrell slammed his fist on the table. "They're turning the sea into a bloody laboratory," he shouted. Around him sat the same group that had cracked the magnetic mine: Ouvry, Lieutenant Lewis, Dr. Francis Birch, and a handful of civilian scientists from Cambridge and Woolwich Arsenal. Ouvry stayed calm. "Then we must make the laboratory ours," he said. What followed was another race against time. The Germans had unleashed an invisible campaign designed not only to sink ships, but to paralyse the nation's trade. Every convoy that entered the Thames or Humber risked annihilation. The Admiralty needed an answer, fast. At Vernon, the scientists improvised with what little they had. They began experimenting with underwater sound, microphones in barrels, oscillators made from salvaged radio parts. Within weeks, they discovered that the acoustic mines responded to specific frequencies, a narrow band that could be matched and countered. Dr. Birch proposed a radical idea. "If the mine listens, we'll sing to it first." Thus was born the deacoustic sweep, a device that generated controlled noise underwater, powerful enough to detonate mines safely at a distance. The first prototype was crude, an engine-driven hammer striking metal plates, towed behind a trawler. The fishermen-turned-minesweepers joked that it sounded like the devil's kettle boiling over. But it worked. One cold February morning, the trawler HMS Pulsar went out on trial off Harwich. The sea was slate grey, the wind cutting. The hammer clanged beneath the hull, sending rhythmic pulses into the deep. Minutes later, a plume of water erupted 200 yards off the bow. Then another, closer. Each detonation rocked the ship, showering her with spray, but none struck home. When Pulsar returned to port, her crew was trembling but alive. The deacoustic sweep had worked, crude, brutal, but effective. Back in London, Winston Churchill, now First Lord of the Admiralty, read the report and scribbled in the margin, "Excellent. Expand immediately." The war of mines had become official policy. The Admiralty began recruiting from universities, pulling physicists from Oxford, engineers from Sheffield, and mathematicians from Edinburgh. Men who once lectured on electromagnetism were now standing knee-deep in seawater, wiring detonators and testing coils. The line between scientist and sailor blurred completely. Yet the enemy always stayed a step ahead. By spring, reconnaissance flights reported new German mines being dropped from Heinkel bombers along the east coast, pressure mines, triggered by the wave of low pressure a ship created as it passed overhead. The pattern was unmistakable: magnetic, acoustic, pressure, each advance met by another. To counter this, the British created the Mine Design Department, a secret branch working directly with Vernon. Here, in low brick buildings behind barbed wire, young scientists in borrowed uniforms scribbled formulas beside sailors who had once hauled nets in the North Sea. Together they built models, sank them in tanks, and argued through the night about field gradients and water pressure curves. The Royal Navy's new motto became "Adapt or Sink." In March 1940, Commander Ouvry wrote in his diary, "This is no longer a war of steel and powder. It is a duel of equations. We fight not the enemy's ships, but his intellect." By summer, Britain had turned the tide. degaussed ships sailed safely up the Thames again. Acoustic and pressure sweeps were clearing channels daily. Convoys resumed their routes to Scapa Flow and Rosyth, guarded by vessels that hummed with the faint electric fields of their own protection. The Admiralty's panic had cooled into grim efficiency. But even in victory, there was unease. Ouvry, watching a line of ships move out to sea one evening, knew the battle would never truly end. The enemy's next invention was already being forged somewhere across the North Sea. Still, for the first time since the Winter of Fear, Britain had an answer, a weapon not of destruction, but of understanding. The invisible war beneath the waves continued, but now both sides listened. By 1941, the invisible war that had begun in panic and smoke was turning in Britain's favour. Every ship that left port now carried invisible armour, loops of copper running beneath her decks, pulsing quietly with current from hidden generators. It was a silent guardian, unseen but vital. The sea that had once betrayed them now yielded to science. The Admiralty called it a technical victory, but to the men at sea it felt like salvation. Merchant skippers who had once refused to sail now watched their compasses steady and their ships glide safely through channels once haunted by sudden fire. Mines still lurked, but the odds had shifted. For the first time since 1939, Britain's lifeline across the Atlantic held firm. At HMS Vernon, the heart of this transformation, work never stopped. The once cramped labs had become workshops of discovery, filled with coils, vacuum tubes, and battered notebooks. Commander Ouvry, now slightly stooped, his uniform smudged with oil, would walk through the rows of benches, pausing to study the latest prototype mine counter. Each new German design was met not with fear now, but with curiosity. "This," he told a visiting officer, gesturing to a half-dismantled mine, "is how we win. Not with guns, with understanding." In Berlin, the Kriegsmarine's mine warfare division struggled to keep pace. Their scientists developed variations, delayed fuses, combination triggers, magnetic pressure hybrids, but the Allies adapted faster. By 1943, British and American engineers were exchanging blueprints in secret meetings, their shared goal simple: make the seas safe again. The quiet war spread far beyond Britain's shores. Degaussing stations rose at Halifax, Alexandria, and Pearl Harbor. Every Allied fleet adopted the technology, winding their ships in loops of copper, humming against the unseen threat. What began as a desperate British improvisation became a global defence, one of the great unseen triumphs of the Second World War. When the war ended, few civilians knew how close Britain had come to strangulation by invisible weapons. The newspapers wrote of Spitfires and Enigma, of D-Day and Dunkirk. But in the tide-washed coves of Kent and the cold waters off Norway, the wrecks of merchantmen told another story: the price of those first months of ignorance before science caught up with fear. On a grey morning in 1946, Ouvry returned to the Solent where it all began. The air smelled of salt and diesel. In the distance, ships moved calmly through the channel, their hulls alive with the quiet hum of magnetic protection. He smiled faintly, remembering the moment he first pried open that German mine years before. The hiss, the silence, the realization that war had entered a new dimension. He placed a hand on the railing, watching the sea roll beneath him. "Invisible enemies," he murmured, "and invisible victories." The waves moved on, indifferent and eternal, but beneath them lay the legacy of those who had fought with wire, current, and courage, the men who had turned fear into science and made the sea safe once more.